Hi, and welcome to our live webinar called Imaging God, Emerging Technology. On behalf of the McMaster Divinity College's Center for Church and Culture, which is what's sponsoring this, we want to bring you this event in anticipation of a symposium that's coming up in May called Christian Formation and Emerging Technologies. And we're hoping that this conversation and the conversation prior to this last October, and we have another conversation coming up in March, can help sort of stir the pot for getting us thinking about this very important conversation that we all need to be having about the future that's emerging here in this 21st century and beyond. What is technology going to do to our lives, and how do we respond as Christians? Our speakers today are Dr. John Hilber, professor of Old Testament here at McMaster, Dr. Lee Beach, associate professor of Christian ministry here at McMaster, and myself, Clement Wen, assistant professor of systematic and historical theology. We have a sort of an interdisciplinary cast today, and really, John Hilber will be sort of kicking us off on a very important topic, and then Lee will be responding, and I'll be here sort of playing moderator. That being said, we will try to make time for your questions. We hope that your questions later on in the session sort of drive the conversation, if I can put it that way. So as the webinar proceeds, please feel free to type your questions or comments, any questions or comments that you have, into the Zoom chat box. And we will try our best to bring some of those questions and comments into the discussion as we're able. And later on in the session, maybe multiple times if we can, we'll also have some time for some live moderated Q&A for those of us who are participating online today. And if you would like to participate by asking a question live here on Zoom with your microphone, please just use the Zoom app of Reaction to raise your hand. And I, as a moderator, will take your questions and comments in order. So I hope we all have a good time together. Sort of just to kick us off for this conversation, we want to sort of pick up on where we left off last time. And last time when we were here talking about discipleship in a new technological era, we received a number of comments in the chat box that we weren't able to respond to. Some of them had to do with pulpit AI or the counseling experience now that we have AI, or even things like the creation of art now that we have AI. And one of the things, as we were discussing as a panel about these questions, it seemed that also the theme of the image of God sort of played a very important part in tying all of these other questions together. And that's why we sort of thought maybe image of God, getting the foundation right, would be a good place for us to start today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over our time to John Hilber, professor of Old Testament here, to talk about his research on image of God, and then Lee will respond. Thanks. John, over to you.
Thank you, Clement, and thank you all for joining us. I want to take the next, about 15 to 20 minutes or so to share some thoughts about what it means to image God or to be the image of God. Because as Clement pointed out, this is in some ways a starting point for all of the different areas that technology touches on in the interface with our lives and theology. There is a lot of confusion out there, not just in the church at the popular level, but even among many theologians about what the image of God means. Those of us who are in Old Testament studies and work in the Old Testament and ancient Near East really have arrived at pretty much a consensus about what the biblical text is saying about the image. And I'd like to share some insights from that. And then after I go through the basic concepts of the image, I just want to throw out the sort of areas that come to mind that are touched on by our theology of the image of God in a sort of practical way. In traditional theology, there are sort of three views on the image of God. The substantive view, which one way or another suggests that there's something intrinsic or inherent in us in terms of our nature as humans that is the image of God. There's the functional view that has come into prominence and dominance more in recent years. And that usually boils down to the idea of humans being in some way co-rulers on earth with God. Now, God is sovereign, but we are appointed as regents on his behalf. And that we'll come back to. That's, I think, at the center of much of it. Then there's also relational thinking about the image of God, that somehow we are unique and have a relationship with God and with each other in a way that the animals and the rest of creation do not. And all three of these views have something to contribute when they are correctly sorted out. And I think it's important for us to not try to think of the biblical concept of the image of God as being isolated as any one of these three. But I think it's important to take all these three and reframe them in the kind of language that the biblical text itself uses. And so I'd like to transform these terms, if you will, into three related terms: form, rule, and relationship, and then take the rest of our time here to talk about what each of those ideas means. First, the concept of form. We are the image of God in form, and that keys off on the actual word itself, image. All we need to do is take a Hebrew lexicon and look the term up, and we find out that the word is the very word itself, image, which is where I get the idea of form from, points to the idea that it's something physical. An image can be something that has similarity in terms of a photographic representation. And 1 Samuel 6 talks about images that are made of mice and things like that. And so the image looks something like the thing that it's representing. Or in the case of Nebuchadnezzar's statue, it doesn't look anything like him. Just notice the dimensions here: a 10-to-1 ratio of height to width. Now, I don't know any basketball player who's 7 foot tall who is that thin. And so this is probably more like an obelisk of some kind. And you would not think that it looks like Nebuchadnezzar himself. So an image is a physical representation that may more or less, or not at all, look in a photographic way like the object. Now, that's going to be important for us, very important for us later. This is one picture of an image of the god Baal from Canaan, and unfortunately, we don't have any actual images from temples. They were generally humanoid, and they were covered with gold for skin, and they've all been stripped of their adornment and their jewels long ago, and the wood has gone to the fire. But this is one that is left over that's gives a picture of the image as a physical representation of the god Baal. Now, it'll be important for us to talk about the fact that an image is, in fact, not just sacred space, but the most sacred space, because the deity inhabits or indwells the image. And this is an example from a text in Egypt. So the god Ptah came to rest after his making everything, having set the gods in their cult places and modeling their bodies to what contents them, so that these gods take up their position in their bodies and every kind of wood and mineral or fruit. In ancient Egypt, they were more or less pantheistic, and so the gods inhabited all these things. But the idea here is that the deity takes up form in the shape of the image. Basically, humans in this view are little idol statues running around on the planet. Just a word about image and likeness. Sometimes people want to make much of the difference between these two terms. They are actually more or less synonymous. You can see the statue picture in front of you. This is an image of a king in the ancient Near East from Tel Fekeri. And he has an inscription on the bottom of this and refers to this statue both as his image and his likeness. And the terms are interchangeable. And this is Aramaic, but the words are pretty much the same as they are in Hebrew. And so we learn that when we're talking about images, that these terms can be used and they don't mean nuances of one thing or another. And while we're on this, notice in this case that this image is a representation of a king. And like Nebuchadnezzar's image, it also represented him in his royal dominion over the territory where he places that image. That's an important concept. So humans are God's image in form. It's a physical representation, and you can turn, if you want in your Bible, we won't go there, but look at Genesis 5:1, where you get God has made Adam in his image, and then Adam reproduces in his image. And interesting in that text, the prepositions in the image and according to the likeness from Genesis, those prepositions are reversed in Genesis 5. And so it's more evidence that they're just interchangeable terms that are being used. So we're God's image in form, also we're God's image in rule. And you'll notice I'm taking this definition right out of the text. This is explicit. There's nothing nebulous or fuzzy at all. It's right there in the text for us. In order that humanity might rule, and many English translations don't carry the nuance over, but the Hebrew syntax, the word order and the form of the verbs that are used is very explicit that there's a purpose involved here. God created humanity in his image in order to rule. NIV catches it, the Net Bible catches it to get that right. Rule. Well, here's a couple of other texts from the ancient Near East, one from Mesopotamia, one from Egypt again, so you can see how widely understood these terms are. The father of the king, my lord, was very image. Salmu, in Hebrew, it's Selim, so it's the same word, whether it's Akkadian or Hebrew. They share the same basic meaning and even sounding of words. The very image of Baal, that's another name for Marduk, a Mesopotamian god. And the king, my lord, is likewise the very image of Baal. Down into Egypt, the deity says to the Pharaoh, "You are my beloved son who came forth from my members, my image, whom I put on earth." And he's given him to rule on the earth in peace. So you see again, the image is a representation that's physical, and the purpose of this image is to represent rule on earth. And ancient Near Eastern kings would ceremonially show their rule on behalf of the deity by slaughtering chaos monsters like lions and hippopotami and crocodiles and things like that, so to show that they are bringing order from chaos. So humans are also God's image in rule, form and rule, and they are functional stewards of creation. You can look at Psalm 8 to see the unpacking of that Genesis text in the Psalm itself, that humanity is made to rule over everything. Form, rule, and then third, relationship. Let's make humanity in our image and our likeness in order that they may rule. What's helpful here is to look at the context, fairly near context, actually, a couple verses before, where God creates everything and he says, okay, let the animals and the plants and everything, they produce after their kind. They do their thing. And there's this third person view of them as creatures. But when it comes to humanity, the person switches to let us make humanity in our image. The text explicitly sets humanity off as different from them, the other that do their thing and reproduce after their kind. God has created us, male and female, the text goes on to say, as God's image, and there's discussion about what the plural our means there. In the original context, it would have referred to some kind of divine council where where God is in fellowship with his angelic host, and they of course have rule over the universe, and humans are made to help to participate and help in some way in that, and so humans are made in the image of God in relationship with the divine realm. We won't get into it, but in the progress of Revelation, we find out there's plurality of persons in the Godhead as well, but that's probably not on the radar screen in Genesis chapter 1, at least to the original audience. Another Egyptian text, I like to illustrate things from the ancient Near East, and so here's another Egyptian text. Well tended is mankind, God's cattle. Now there's a special shepherd flock kind of metaphor going on, only instead of a flock, it's a herd. Which is common also in Mesopotamia, that the deity has special care. He made sky and earth for their sake. He subdued the water monster. There's terms in Leviathan, Tanin, and the Hebrew Bible that talk about God subduing the water monster as well. He made breath for their noses to live. If that sounds like Genesis 2, that shouldn't surprise us. They are his images who came from his body. So there's a special tenderness and care, not just for the king, which is the dominant use of image in the ancient Near East, but here in this one text in Egypt, we see that they had the concept of humanity as a whole being the image. So humans are God's image in form, or physical representations. In rule, we have a designated task or function to represent God in his stewardship, in our stewardship of creation. And then third, that we image God in a relationship. We are creatures in divine community. Again, Psalm 8, God made humanity a little lower than the Elohim. That's a generic term for God and the angelic hosts, everything that inhabits heaven. Hebrews picks it up and says, it quotes that term and uses the word angel in quoting Psalm 8. So we are creatures in divine community. Just one section of the New Testament to look at. We could go on and on with this, but Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, and through him, God reconciles all things to himself. So there you've got Jesus as the image, the visible, embodied representation of the invisible God. Firstborn is a term of royalty in the Old Testament, and in the context, Jesus rules and dominion over everything. And then he reconciles everything to himself. If you continue reading after verse 20, in particular, he redeems humanity and creates his church, his body from that. And then later Paul says, you all, as the plural form, the plural preposition is used there in the text. You, church, plurality, all of you have put off the old humanity. Elsewhere, Paul talks about the old Adam, and you put on the new humanity, which is being renewed in the knowledge in the image of its creator. So we as a corporate entity also become the image. And there's a lot of discussion among Old Testament theologians about how the image in Genesis itself is both individual and corporate as well. So what's the image? We represent God in form, physical bodies. Rule, we are stewards of creation, ruling under God. And in relationship, we participate in special fellowship with God and others in the divine council, his angelic host, with whom he also has special relationship with. So the implications here come out pretty quickly when we start thinking about it. If we are God's image as embodied beings, then we can start talking about bioethics, the beginning of life, the end of life. We can start talking about artificial intelligence in computers, or even more sophisticated in robots. And that we can get off into the conversation. I'm not going to launch into it now, just throwing these things out. to get our mental processes going. The term transhumanism is becoming a big deal now. We are humans, and then there's this transition that some people see us in, transhuman, moving to post-human, where we might become completely disembodied in our entire brain functions are uploaded into a neural net that is electronic in a computer, or into a body that has that's a mechanical body that's robotic. So transhumanism leads to post-humanism. This business of embodiment is important there. Human augmentation, prosthetics, gets into genetic engineering, um, putting a neural net on our brain and uploading our brain into a computer, or controlling things from our brains. That this business of image of God as form feeds into that as well. When it comes to rule, do we share our status? And the image of God is a status as much as it is also our actual physical being itself. Do we have the right to share that with robots, for example? And then there are a lot of things about the image that are sort of just implicit. People like to say intellect, emotion, and will. Well, that's sort of necessary to function well. That's not, in the core of the image itself. Our subordination to God's pretty explicit in Genesis chapter 2. And so this whole business of moral responsibility, and do we let machines have that? So are there other equals that we have? Are we as image bearers, do we have the right to make other image bearers? Well, we can in our children, but outside of that, what do we say? Relationship. What about brain function? What happens when we reach a late stage in life and develop Alzheimer's, and have late stage Alzheimer's where we completely shut down, basically comatose in terms of our function with the rest of society and the world around us? Well, does that mean we're any less the image of God? And I use this to illustrate why all three components are important, because each of us to a different degree function more or less, better or worse, as image bearers. As someone once said, the fall is not well managed on the planet today. Too painfully aware of that. And so we are imperfect, and some of us are better than others in this regard. But if we lose a function, well, we're still the form. And so form is critical to hold on to when we talk about losing some of these functions. Truth. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Truth is personal in biblical terms, because truth has to do with fidelity and relationship. Do machines have capacity for truth, or do they just store data? Who evaluates? So this comes into play on the question of epistemology, and whether truth is interpersonal or just bare facts that can be disputed. If we develop sophisticated robots, and we begin to treat robots in a certain way, does that then impact the way we start treating each other because of the way we treat robots? Anyway, the list can go on. As we're saying, there's question of art, music, spiritual development, cosmic powers. Can demons and influence machines as they can humans? The questions get to be quite fun. And so that's what the remaining 30 minutes or so of our time together is going to be about, to start that conversation.
Thanks so much, Sean, for that quick recap of Image of God research in Old Testament. Lee, I imagine you have some things you'd like to respond to there. I'll turn the time.
Yeah, so thanks for that, John. And this is such a really crucial, and your biblical, the first part it helped us think about the image of God. But then your reflections on that, I think, are catalytic, because that's really key for us to be thinking about. And I think a lot of our conversation is around this idea of what I would call, and others have called, sort of this embodied artificial intelligence, or we call it now artificial, we'll see. But it's this idea of how it's being increasingly embodied. And I also just want to say, we're in the midst of a very early and evolving conversation around Christian ethics and theological reflection on these things. And what I like about our time here today is that we're trying to stimulate this conversation, because the church has to have it. We've got to have it. It's happening, and it's coming strong. And I admit that as I talk about some of these things, it sounds outlandish to me, but at the same time, I realize that these are real things. So just a couple, I don't want to belabor too much, but I want to say a few things to John, some of the things that John raised there. And I'm going to tell this story. I wasn't sure, but because I don't want to be salacious, I don't want to be, overly provocative, but this is just a true story. So a couple years ago, I was teaching a course. I was teaching a course, and I was teaching in one of the classes I wanted to talk about artificial intelligence and how the church needs to think about it and respond to it. So I was, doing my research, reading some books. I went online to do some work on trying to understand what's going on out there and what's possible and what's apparently happening. And so I learned a lot of things. One of the things that struck me and stood with me, and again, I'm not trying to be sensational here, but this is just the truth, was one of the things a couple of websites I came upon was the possibility, or the reality, actually, it's a reality, of having sex with a robot. And this wasn't pornographic or anything. It was real. It was this thing about this idea and it's basically about companionship. It's this idea that people could make, relationships with robots, and they look sort of human, more or less human, and that the idea of having intercourse is a real thing. And it's actually, the technology apparently is actually there and available. And for me, this became a clarifying moment because it made me think, like, okay, so is it okay to have sex with a robot? I'm a married man. I understand that as I read the Bible, that it's clear to me about the idea that I'm called to be faithful to my marriage covenant, my marriage vows, and for me to have sex with another human being outside of my wife is inappropriate. It's a sin. It's wrong. I understand that. But what about a robot? If a robot is just a machine, just a tool, and I know many of you're immediately going, oh, you're figuring, you have a visceral. I'll tell you, I know my wife has a clear answer to this question. She was very explicit with me about any possibility. But the question really comes down to this idea of image of God. Because if a robot is just a machine, if artificial intelligence that's somehow embodied is just a machine or a tool, then that's a particular category of how we're going to think about that theologically. If all of a sudden they are image bearers somehow, then I think that also shapes how we think about these things. And so we have to think about that. We have to think about what is some of this technology that's emerging. Could it be possible, and John alluded to this, do we as human beings have some right or some ability to make others who also bear the image of God? Of course, as John said, our children, we think about that, but does it go beyond that? Can we create things that can bear the image of God beyond just biological creation? And what will it be like if we talk about this technology? It's not just this technology is such that maybe as we encounter this technology, they can perform an aria for us. Then in the next minute, they can explain some of the finer points of Plato to us. And perhaps then they can whip up a nice spaghetti bolognese for us to have for dinner. This isn't just any other kind of technology. This isn't like a pitchfork. It's a tool that's useful. This is a whole different realm of technology. And can we somehow, because it's true, we as humans have created these possibilities. Could it be that it's within the realm of creation for us to be able to say this is somehow another expression of the image of God that is a part of our creative ability, our creative participation in God's ongoing work of creation that we are participating in, that somehow actually bears God's image in a real way. So I say that because I think that this is an ethical reality that we have to think about and work through. Because on the other hand, I'll say this, and this is a second thing, to the idea of the image of God. What if we're in a situation where here we are, we're existing on the planet, and we as humans are here, and we are with an entity, a being who exists in some way similar to humanity, but actually is superior to us because they have, well, I know, and there's ways maybe we as humans will become able to, put a chip in our brain and have access to the internet. I understand. So at least they're at least equal to us in the sense that but at this current time, or, in a certain sense, they at least are equal to us in terms of their intelligence, in terms of their capabilities, in terms of all that they can do. They're equal, perhaps even potentially, at least at some point, maybe superior to us. And then we're to say, yes, but we're the ones who are in the image of God, and you're not. We're a little superior to you because God created us. He didn't create you. And so somehow we're one step above. How is that different from a culture where white people said the same thing to black people? And you create a culture where there's this contention about who's got more of the image, and how did that go? And so the idea is how do we live in a culture or place where perhaps we're living with other kinds of beings who are at least equal with us, if not potentially even somewhat superior. And so this becomes a key question for us to have to think about: what does it mean to be the bearer of the image of God? And how do we as a church relate to and understand how to function with something that we've never had to think about or deal with before? And then a third thing I just want to touch on, John touched on too, about the implications of these things for just technology in terms of human life, and the place of autonomy as those who are image bearers. I think part of the reality of being an image bearer is that God imbued humankind with free choice. And we know that from the Genesis narrative, that human beings had the ability, they had autonomy, they had the ability to choose. And I think it's a gift that God has given us. It's obviously a gift we can go very wrong with, but it is part of the reality of being a human being in relationship with God, is that God gives us autonomy. And so as we look at the new suite of choices that are being given to us as human beings in terms of how to manage our lives, how to maybe even manage our children's lives, the unborn's lives, and those kinds of things, the place of autonomy becomes important, I think, in the sense that this is part of our bearing the image. And so as we are making choices about how to use these new technologies that are available to us, the church needs to have a wideness in its thinking, in my mind, that it respects and embraces the reality that these things are developed. We need to think about them critically, but we also need to empower people to use their God-given autonomy to be able to make their choices. And the church, I think, has to be, at least at this point, learning to be very gracious and open to the idea that we have the autonomy to use these gifts that God has given us, and we need to figure that out, work through that. But the church has a way sometimes of being very narrow and judgmental in its thinking towards people. I would argue we need to have a wideness in our thinking towards these things that allow people to exercise their God-given autonomy as image bearers, and to enjoy and engage in this in these technologies as benefits them the best as they decide. The other last thing I'll say, and maybe we can talk about this more, is that I think we're in a place in our time where we need new theological categories of thinking. Maybe that's obvious, maybe that's a very obvious statement. But we need to think about things, even things like the image of God, in ways that we haven't thought about them before, because we're on the precipice, or maybe we've even come off the precipice and we're actually just into it now, in a time that we have not known in human history. And my sense is that when the church is at its best, it responds to that, not by hunkering down and pulling back and saying, we already know what to think about this because we've done it for so long. No, we need to start thinking about what are some new theological categories? What are some new ways that we have to start thinking that are faithful to our historic theology, but also are faithful to the evolving reality of the world that we live in and that God continues to be present in? And what does it mean for us to think newly, think differently, think more openly about some of the ways that we've done theology in the past? Can we create a way, think about bearing the image of God, that absorbs some of the newness of the reality that we find ourselves in? So I say that as not someone who thinks I've got it figured out, but who realizes this conversation has to proceed. Okay, thank you.
Well, that's a very provocative response, Lee. Thank you so much for that. Maybe I can hand the time back over to John if you want to respond to Lee. And also, there's some questions in the chat box. Maybe I can draw your attention to questions about men and women, both made in the image of God. Can our Trinitarian God be imaged also as female? Are women made to rule as well? If Jesus is fully the image of God, he is not a woman. What does that mean? And does it also affect a marriage to have sex with a tool? Anything else as well as our spouse? Could it be useful for those who have little hope of a human sexual partner? Could it solve cultural problems of crimes against women? These are all very important questions, and I'll turn those over to John. Thanks.
All right, I want to know who DS is so we can kick that person out of the chat room. Those are tough questions. My microphone isn't very loud, first of all, so I need to speak up then, evidently. Okay. Men and women are explicitly named in the text as image of God. I think this reflects the corporate dimension of the image. It's something I didn't punctuate very much in my short, brief presentation, but image bearing is an individual an individual concept. And you know that because if an individual person is murdered, you have murdered God in effigy. Genesis chapter 9. So individually, we are image bearers. But the image of God is a corporate concept. It's seen first in Genesis when God says male and female, so that there's a horizontal relationship as well as a vertical relationship that is part of image bearing. And we saw that in the New Testament text when the church becomes the body of Christ, who's the image of God. So there's a singular concept of unity with the church, but yet there's a multifaceted corporate element of that. And then then we can get into marriage as one example of a corporate reflection of plurality within the unified Godhead. So we have to keep in mind this singular and plural dimension of the image whenever we try to think through some of those things. And so, yes, my personal opinion is that women are granted equal status in humanity's stewardship, if you want to call it rule, over creation. That's my view. I know it gets more complicated, and there are others that would nuance it a little differently. So I just acknowledging that. See, try to get these questions first, and then I'll try to get back to Lee's thoughts. If Jesus is fully yes. I've struggled with this one about Jesus. He's fully the image of God, and yet he's male. And I'm not completely intellectually satisfied with what I've read or what I've thought about. Genesis 1 is binary, male and female. And I suppose Jesus could have come as intersex. And the ancient church, I mean, the rabbis and I can take you to a Mesopotamian text. They understood what intersex was. People that are born with physiologically ambiguous features. And I suppose it's theoretically possible, but practically not. God became incarnate in the form that accommodated to what was needed, in the moment. That's the way I think about that. And there's a binary choice that was necessarily made at that point. But beyond that, that's pretty speculative stuff. But I'm very aware of how intentional Jesus was to draw women into his fellowship of disciples. And in fact, in some ways was more dependent on them even to the end in the crucifixion and resurrection witnesses. So let's just say that Jesus recognized that the image of God had its best expression when it functioned in a healthy way in community that is male and female. So I don't know if that's satisfactory. Maybe some other people have, Clement, you've thought more about anthropology theologically than I have. So jump in anytime as well, or Lee to come back. But that's the best way I can sort out the idea that Jesus is the image, and yet he was, necessarily an individual who was male, but his church, the body, is composed of male and female, and slave and free, and Jew and Gentile, and male and female are all part of that. And then let's see. The questions are coming in faster than I can get to them. There was I don't want to dodge the sex question that Lee brought up, raised. Thanks, Lee, I mean, what's so good about that is it's raising provocative, hard issues.
Yeah,
And
it's not really a sex. That's my fear. It's not so much a question about sex as it is about, the humanity or
I get it. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. I mean, what it does is it forces us to think in very concrete ways about other dimensions of humanness. And I think intimacy in marriage is, you could argue, is the most um, profound expression of unity in plurality. And what is the product of that? But I mean, man and woman come together, and what they produce, their child, is a unified expression of the two of them. So, I mean, this is sex is very relational. And those of you who are into, especially who do therapy and that kind of thing, you know better than I just how deep and at the core of our being, sexuality really is, as a part of that. So I think, and of course, maybe I'm tipping, my hand, showing my cards a little bit at this point, even about how I would initially, at least, I'm open to conversation, but initially frame up that, my thoughts about, sex with a robot or whatever. I think it raises a really important relational type questions that are at the core of this. I don't want to, I've got other interesting questions here, but I want to leave it back for Lee or Clement to jump in.
I want to respond a little bit to what Lee was talking about with the question about sex with a robot. And my response here is not necessarily to say that I agree with what Thomas Aquinas was saying or not. I just want to bring up that within the history of the church, Aquinas and also, I believe, Augustine had some very interesting responses to the problem or the issue of prostitution. I can put it that way, in the sense that they believed that it was obviously morally not a good thing, but they also believed, Aquinas especially believed, that if you were to remove prostitution from society, that would actually create greater harm for society than if you left it in place. I think there was just sort of a realism to that that I thought was that I think is interesting to ponder. I think back to if we want to be sort of like idealistic or realistic in terms of our response to something like new technologies, when we're talking, for example, about some of the moral things of it, and if you were to leave those things unchecked, does it do something to society? If you don't leave it unchecked, do we create more harm than if we try to check it? Um, but I think back too, if we think about, say, idealism versus realism, I did a short-term missions trip one summer to Amsterdam to the red light district and was working at one of the Christian youth hostels there. And as we walked around the city and as our guide sort of talked about some of the issues within the city, within the red light district, he said that in their Christian ministry, what they would do is they would allow for people who were drug addicts to come to them and ask for new needles. They would replace old needles with new needles. And then they would hand out condoms to the prostitutes who were working the red light district. And, for a more idealist perspective on this, we would sort of be in shock and say, oh my goodness, you're encouraging sin. But from a more realist perspective, they knew that the society and the cultural impetuses that were happening within that part of the world and that part of the city were probably very systemically rooted, and you can't just blanket, condemn it. You also need to find ways to realistically respond in a way that maybe you can't achieve the greatest good, but maybe you can achieve a better good than what we already had if we didn't respond at all. I just wonder if some thoughts like this, from a more realist perspective, can help contribute to a future Christian response to things. But yeah, Lee, let me turn the time back over to you. And then I do want to see if anyone has any live questions they want to ask. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to just go to live question. I mean, I think the thing about what you said, Clement, is, and I appreciate that, and I get that. And sometimes I'm for that. I think, we have to be pragmatists and realists in our ministry. But it's still thinking and see, this is a new category. Like if you talk about giving condoms to prostitutes and needle, that's a good thing. Like I like what you said, and I get it, and we accommodate and we try and do things that are just this is just good pragmatic ministry showing love, whatever. And I know it can be controversial, but the difference is here is that this is something very different. It's not anything we've dealt with before in terms, and Deborah has a question there about, can you become emotionally attached? Well, and she talked about her car. We all get sometimes emotionally attached to technology. And if I've with the movie, I think it's called She. It was with what's the guy? Anyway, I forget the guy, but the voice was Scarlett Johansson. And the guy kind of built a relationship with his phone, right? He had this woman's voice on his phone, and he essentially fell in love with her. And that technology is coming out. If it hasn't already come out, that's on our Apple phone next version or whatever. If you haven't seen the commercials, that's what you got on your next Apple phone. And so these are just very different questions. Like we're in it, I think what you said is helpful, but it's a whole new dimension of thinking that we're moving into, an experience, not just thinking, but experience that we're moving into. And so I think you're right. I think we need to have some ability to accommodate these things, but they're still completely different from those things that you had to work through in your ministry in Amsterdam. It's just a different day. And I'll say one more thing. There's a question there, Ted, something about new theologies and new ideas. Well, that's what the church has done for 2,000 years. I mean, this isn't anything brand new. We're constantly rethinking our theology and what by what authority and who chooses what's right and what's wrong. Well, that's been the conversation of the church for 2,000 years. This is just a new vista of it. There's nothing here that we're talking about that hasn't been talked about before. It's just a whole new category of things that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think there's some very valuable insights there, Lee, that you're offering, and really appreciate your comment back. Let me see if there's anyone live who would like to ask a question. Hopefully we have time for two of them. Does anyone want to ask a live question? If you do, just raise your hand and I'll give the time over to Anson. How about you? Thanks.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Hi, Clement.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, good. I have a question about our social economics like realities. So today, like 99% of our population no longer needs to toil the soil to make a living, right? As agricultural automation has largely taken over that role. And on the other side, women can also opt for painless childbirth, right? These are what technology can help us. So what if one day we have artificial super intelligence paired with like robotics that can usher us into a post-work society with like everything's like super abundant and we need not work anymore. And medical advances might largely eliminate all pain and diseases. Would that mean we have undone the curse of Genesis 3 through technology? And what are the theological implications of such a scenario?
John or Lee, you want to take that one? Go for it, John.
Yeah. Thanks, Anson. A great question. I think Jesus set for us the example that mitigating the consequences of the fall is something that is our kingdom business. In other words, there were consequences of the fall, but yet redemption is to recreate. And God's intention is for that, to happen ultimately in full 100% realization in a new creation. And when the kingdom broke in with the king, the cross, of course, the atonement sets the groundwork for final consummation of the recreation, but built into the atonement is healing. I hope, I'm in a resurrection body. I'm not Pentecostal, and so I don't misread me. I don't name and claim, whenever I want. But Jesus set the example in his kingdom work of mitigating the consequences of the fall, and I think we are called to the same task. Now, the difficulty is, let's just take human augmentation. I don't know anyone who would argue that a prosthetic, a mechanical arm, even one that's hooked up to the neural net, so it's more nimble and instantaneous. I don't know anyone who has questions about, prosthetics. And so where do you stop? I mean, do we become a cyborg where all of a sudden all we are is our immaterial functions that have now been uploaded into a neural net in a robot? Well, then do we become immortal? And I don't know the answer theologically where augmentation ends, and maybe this is the right word. This is what I'm thinking about now. The striving for immortality is wrong, because we are told that our expectations for immortality and the eschaton for the future is in a resurrection. It's God's work. So anyway, I don't know, Anson, if that's sufficient or whatever, but it maybe gets us thinking about it. I don't want to. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to get out of the way here and not muse anymore.
Thanks so much, Anson, for the question, and John for your quick response. One final question from Ted. Ted, can I turn the time over to you?
Sure. Both to John and also to Lee. John, it strikes me that in your Old Testament view of the image of God is usually an assignment to rulers to rule over the population based on their ability to rule as having value and figures of God. So I would submit that the Old Testament, in terms of that image of God, is really moving God into the human, as opposed to, as I pointed out, an anthropological change of trying to figure out who God is. In the New Testament, we find that God is only a spirit and not human. So from that perspective, I guess I have difficulty in terms of the theological perspective, but also from the technological perspective. From my perspective, I've been around technology all of my life, and technology is a tool to get stuff done. The real question is, how do we use those tools? And our Christian thought is, regardless, our mission is to be charitable, help, heal, and improve the lives of others in society. And if we can do that with technology, I think that's consistent with the Christian view. If we are not doing that in terms of hurting others, as is an atomic bomb, as is euthanasia, and all those other technologies which are available to us, I would submit that the Christian value is counter to the use of that technology. So as technology moves through and changes, the question from a Christian perspective is, what is this doing in terms of our Christian life, in terms of expanding the gospel into community with healing, charitable donations, and kindness and effectiveness? Is it a tool or is it something else? So from my perspective, trying to refigure this from a theological perspective, I think is pretty easy from my perspective.
John or Lee, you want to respond?
I think I agree with you, Ted, that, I mean, the incarnation, it's divine taking on human form. And so I do not want to reverse engineer what God is like outside of the license that God has given me in Revelation to do that. In other words, God is accommodated through analogy, knowledge of himself through, first and foremost, a human being named Jesus Christ. And so I'm not trying to, I don't want to read humanity back into God, but recognize that humanity is a limited analogy to God. And so we are physical representatives, but that doesn't mean that God, I don't like the thought, and there are a lot of people that think this, that God is embodied in heaven even. Jewish theologians, and anyway, that goes a direction I don't want to go, but Yeah, so I'm largely agreeing, and I think that what you said brought to mind the whole category of wisdom literature. And the theology of wisdom in the Old Testament is really, first and foremost, a handmaiden of a ruler. God uses wisdom in creation, kings use wisdom to rule, and then with that comes in all of the moral and divine design considerations that need to help inform us in how we use technology as a tool.
Mhm.
So I think that's just, I think I'm agreeing with what you're saying.
Lee, do you want to give a quick response too?
Yeah, just a quick response. I like the fact that Ted, that you're like that you want to help you. You're glad technology helps people and stuff. That's great. But I really disagree with you when you say it's thinking about this as easy. I think that's a problem. I think it's not at all. I think it's a whole new vista that we haven't. It's very complex and is actually very challenging for the church today for us to think about these things in terms of how our established theology relates to some of these things. And I think it's a mistake to think it's easy. I also would say, and this is just riffing a little bit off your comment, that what I would invite us to is for us to think about, how do we embrace some of these things, and then if we have to so the church tends to we on all new things, the church tends to hunker down and get narrow, and it's like, oh, we got to protect everything, oh boy, this is bad, we got to. And then what happens is people get hurt and people get marginalized because, so they decided to, and this isn't even really actually high technology, so they choose to have an assisted suicide, or they get ostracized, their family gets ostracized, and all of that stuff, and they get hurt by it. Or, God forbid, I'm going to get labeled as this someone chooses to have sex with a robot. Sorry. And all of a sudden they're terrible people. We need to, I say we need to start wide and go like, let's understand some options are out here that have never been out there before. And let's work towards this. And if we have to move closer to a more narrow perspective, then let's theologically reflect as the church and move towards an appropriate ethical understanding. But let's not start by alienating people for choosing things that are now available to them, which weren't available to them in years past. And let's be a gracious people who understand we're just trying to figure this out. And in the meantime, people might do things that we don't, it's complex. We don't understand, but it's available to them and they're doing what they think is best for them. But we have to have this conversation as a church so that we can be a guide, so that we can have a voice, so that we can offer some theologically responsible ways to think about these things. But that's not easy. That's an effort it's going to take. But in the meantime, let's make sure we're gracious and open towards the way people choose to embrace technology in their lives.
Wow, it's been such a very interesting conversation this hour, and I'm really grateful for everyone joining us today, giving up your lunchtime to come and listen in. And thanks so much for all the questions in the chat box, as well as I want to especially thank John Hilber and Lee Beach for their being panelists here, and also for those of you who asked live questions as well. And just a reminder, all of this is sort of just gearing up for our Christian Formation and Emerging Technologies Church and Culture Symposium on Thursday, May 8th here at McMaster Divinity College, sponsored by our Center for Church and Culture. We do have some keynote speakers that day who are experts in their fields with regard to some of these questions. And we also have a number of presentations lined up that hope to address things with some specialization. So we do hope for that. I believe we also have another webinar coming up in March, and we invite you to join us for that. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we hope to see you later on at more of these events. Bye now.